The cold wind carried a lonesome howl across the barren New Mexico territory, as Abigail Winters clutched her infant daughter closer to her chest, desperate to shield the baby from the biting November chill of 1881. Her threadbare shawl offered little protection against the elements, as she huddled beneath the meager shelter of a jutting rock formation outside the small settlement of Hatchita. The wagon that had carried her hopes west lay broken 2 miles back, abandoned like the promises her late husband had made before typhoid claimed him in El Paso. Abigail's tears had long since dried, leaving only determination etched into her once soft features. 22 years old and already a widow with a 3-month-old daughter, she had nothing but the small bundle of possessions beside her and the locket containing a lock of her husband's hair. The money had run out days ago, forcing her to trade her wedding ring for passage on a wagon train that had ultimately left her behind when her coughing fits convinced the others she carried disease. "Hush now, Emma," she whispered as the baby stirred fitfully against her chest. "Mama's got you. We'll make it to town by morning." But the night was getting colder, and Abigail knew her strength was failing. With trembling hands, she spread her only blanket on the hard-packed earth and gently laid Emma down, tucking the corners around the infant's tiny form. The baby's face, so much like her father's, screwed up briefly before settling back into sleep, unaware of their desperate circumstances. Abigail lay down beside her daughter, curling her body protectively around the small bundle. The ground leached what little warmth remained in her bones, and she shivered violently, wondering if they would survive until dawn. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through her haze of exhaustion. Abigail pushed herself up on one elbow, her heart racing with fear and a flicker of hope. A lone rider appeared through the twilight, the silhouette of a man on horseback approaching steadily. "Hello, the camp," a deep voice called out, respectfully keeping his distance. "I have nothing worth stealing," Abigail called back, her voice cracking from thirst and fear. The rider dismounted, leading his horse the last few yards. As he drew closer, Abigail could make out his features in the fading light, tall and weathered, with broad shoulders and a face that had seen its share of sun and hardship. He wasn't young, perhaps in his early 30s, but his movements were fluid and strong as he approached. "I'm not looking to steal, madam," he said, removing his hat to reveal dark hair flecked with dust from the trail. "Name's Daniel Russell. I was heading to Hatchita when I spotted your fire." "I have no fire," Abigail replied, gesturing to their pitiful camp. Daniel's eyes took in the scene, the young woman with exhaustion etched on her face, and the baby wrapped in a thin blanket on the hard ground. His expression softened with concern. "Her baby slept on the ground beside her," he muttered to himself before meeting Abigail's wary gaze. His voice grew firm with quiet resolve. "You'll never sleep cold again, not if I have anything to say about it." The unexpected kindness in his words nearly broke Abigail's composure. She brushed a strand of auburn hair from her face, trying to maintain dignity despite her circumstances. "I don't accept charity, Mr. Russell." "It's not charity to help a neighbor," he replied, already unrolling a bedroll from his pack. "And out here, we're all neighbors." He paused, his keen eyes assessing her condition. "When did you last eat, madam?" Abigail's silence was answer enough. "I've got beans and jerky," he said, not waiting for her permission as he began gathering kindling for a fire. "And coffee if you're partial to it." Despite her pride, Abigail couldn't deny her hunger or the dangerous cold that threatened her baby. "Thank you," she whispered, the words nearly lost in the wind. As Daniel built a small fire, its warmth gradually penetrating the chill that had settled into Abigail's bones, she found herself studying him covertly. His hands were calloused but gentle as he prepared a simple meal, his movements efficient and purposeful. "You're a long way from anywhere," he observed, offering her a tin cup of steaming coffee. Abigail accepted the cup, letting its warmth seep into her palms. "I was headed to Silver City. My husband's brother has a claim there." Had, she corrected herself quietly. "Thomas died 3 months ago in El Paso, typhoid." Daniel nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry for your loss, madam." "Abigail," she said. "Abigail Winters, Mrs. Winters," he acknowledged with a respectful nod. "And who's this little one?" "Emma," Abigail replied, her voice softening as she glanced at her sleeping daughter. "She never got to know her father." Daniel offered her a plate of beans. "Silver City's still a good 40 miles northwest. Hachita's just 5 miles east. Not much of a town, but there's a boarding house and a general store." Abigail hesitated. "I have no money for boarding." "Mrs. Lacey, who runs the place, needs help," Daniel said. "She's getting on in years, and her arthritis makes it hard for her to keep up with the cooking and cleaning. She might trade room and board for work." Hope flickered in Abigail's eyes for the first time in weeks. "I'm a good cook," she said, "and I can sew and clean." Daniel nodded. "We'll head there at first light." He glanced at Emma. "Your little one shouldn't spend another night on the ground." As the night deepened around them, Abigail found herself telling Daniel about her journey west from Missouri, about Thomas's dreams of striking silver, and about the series of misfortunes that had left her stranded. Daniel listened without judgment, occasionally adding wood to the fire and making sure Abigail ate her fill. When Emma awoke hungry, Abigail nursed her discreetly while Daniel busied himself tending his horse. His respectful distance and matter-of-fact kindness gradually eased her wariness. "You know Hachita well?" she asked when he returned to the fire. "Well enough," Daniel replied. "I've got a small spread about 10 miles north, cattle mostly. I come to town every few weeks for supplies." "You're a rancher then, started that way," he said with a slight smile. "Though these days I do more work as the territory's deputy marshal. The badge pays when the cattle don't." Abigail's eyes widened slightly. "A lawman." "Don't worry," he said, reading her expression. "I'm not chasing anyone tonight. Just heading back from delivering a prisoner to the territorial court in Mesilla." As the fire burned down to embers, Daniel insisted Abigail and Emma take his bedroll. "I've slept under the stars plenty of times," he said when she protested. "You need the rest more than I do." That night, wrapped in the warmth of a proper blanket with her daughter safely beside her, Abigail slept deeply for the first time in weeks. She dreamed of a home with solid walls and a warm hearth, and somewhere in that dream was the steady presence of a man with kind eyes and capable hands. Dawn broke clear and cold over the New Mexico landscape. Abigail woke to find Daniel already up, tending a small breakfast fire with coffee brewing. Emma was awake but content, her tiny fists waving in the morning air. "Morning," Daniel greeted her. "Hope you slept well." "Better than I have in a long time," Abigail admitted, sitting up and straightening her rumpled dress. She felt suddenly self-conscious of her appearance. Her once fine dress was travel-stained, and she hadn't properly washed her hair in days. Daniel pretended not to notice, handing her a cup of coffee instead. "We should reach Hachita by mid-morning. My horse can carry you both." "I can walk," Abigail insisted. Daniel's expression remained neutral, but his eyes showed concern. "No need to overtire yourself, Mrs. Winters. Save your strength for convincing Mrs. Lacey to hire you." After a simple breakfast, Daniel helped Abigail gather her meager possessions. When he lifted her carpet bag, surprise flickered across his face at its lightness. Everything she owned in the world barely weighed more than a saddle. "Ready?" he asked, holding out his hands to help her mount. Abigail hesitated. then nodded. With Emma securely wrapped against her chest, she allowed Daniel to boost her onto his horse. He swung up behind her, careful to maintain a respectful distance while ensuring she and the baby were secure. As they rode toward Hachita, the sun climbing higher in the sky, Abigail became increasingly aware of Daniel's presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the strength in his arms as he held the reins, the faint scent of leather and pine that clung to him. "What brought you out west, Mr. Russell?" she asked, partly to distract herself from these unsettling observations. "Daniel," he corrected gently. "The war, like many men, couldn't go back to Tennessee after what I'd seen. Figured the territories offered a fresh start." "You fought for the Union?" Abigail asked cautiously. "Yes, madam," he replied. "Though I've found most folks out here don't much care which side you were on, too busy fighting the land and the elements to keep old grudges alive." Abigail nodded. Her father had supported the Confederacy, but he had also taught her that character mattered more than politics. And the man who had saved her and her daughter from a cold night on the hard ground had shown his character through actions rather than words. Hachita appeared on the horizon as a scattered collection of buildings, modest but solid structures that represented civilization after days of wilderness. Abigail felt a flutter of nervous anticipation as they approached. The town consisted of a single main street with wooden buildings lining both sides, a general store, a saloon, a small church, and various businesses necessary for frontier life. People moved about their morning business, pausing occasionally to glance at the newcomers. Daniel guided his horse to a two-story building with a sign declaring it Lacey's boarding house. The structure was weathered but well-maintained, with curtains in the windows and a small garden plot to one side. "Wait here," Daniel said, dismounting and tying his horse to the hitching post. "I'll speak to Mrs. Lacey first." Abigail watched as he disappeared into the building, suddenly fearful that this tentative plan would fall through, leaving her once again with nowhere to go. Emma stirred against her chest, making small, hungry sounds that increased Abigail's anxiety. After what seemed an eternity, Daniel emerged with an elderly woman who squinted up at Abigail with shrewd assessment. Mrs. Lacey was tiny but straight-backed, with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and hands gnarled with arthritis. "So this is your widow woman, Deputy Russell?" the old woman asked, her voice surprisingly strong. "This is Mrs. Winters and her daughter Emma," Daniel replied. "Mrs. Winters, this is Martha Lacey." Daniel helped Abigail down from the horse, and she stood as straight as her exhaustion would allow, meeting Mrs. Lacey's evaluating gaze. "You can cook?" the old woman asked without preamble. "Yes, madam, and sew and clean." "Can you read? I need someone to keep my accounts." "I can read and cipher," Abigail confirmed. "I taught school before I married." This seemed to impress Mrs. Lacey more than anything else. "A educated woman," she mused. "Well, I can't pay much, but I can offer room and board and $2 a week." It was a modest offer, but more than Abigail had dared hope for. "Thank you, Mrs. Lacey, I accept." "Room's small but clean," Mrs. Lacey continued. "You'll help with breakfast and dinner for the boarders, cleaning, laundry on Mondays." She glanced at Emma. "Baby's welcome as long as she don't disturb the paying guests." "She's a good baby," Abigail assured her. Mrs. Lacey nodded. "Well, come in then. You look like you could use a hot bath and a proper meal." Daniel remained by his horse as the women headed toward the boarding house door. Abigail turned back, suddenly realizing she hadn't properly thanked him for his kindness. "Mr. Russell, Daniel," she called. "I don't know how to thank you." He settled his hat on his head, offering her a small smile. "No thanks needed, Mrs. Winters, just doing what any decent man would do. Will you?" Abigail hesitated, surprised by her reluctance to see him ride away. Will you be staying in town? Got business at the marshal's office, he replied, but I'll be back through Hachita in a few weeks. He tipped his hat. Take care of yourself and that little one, Mrs. Winters. As he mounted his horse, Mrs. Lacey clicked her tongue. That man, she said with grudging admiration. Always finding strays to help. Is that what I am? Abigail asked, a note of defensiveness creeping into her voice. A stray, Mrs. Lacey's weathered face softened slightly. We're all strays out here, child. That's why we look after each other. She ushered Abigail inside. Now come along. That baby needs a warm place, and you need rest. The boarding house was clean and modestly furnished, with a dining room on the ground floor and rooms above. Mrs. Lacey showed Abigail to a small but tidy room at the back of the second floor. Bathrooms down the hall, the older woman explained. I'll have hot water brought up. Dinner's at 6. You can start work tomorrow after you've rested. Alone in the room, Abigail sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. Yesterday, she had been facing a night on the hard ground with her infant daughter, uncertain if either would survive until morning. Today, they had shelter, the promise of food and work that would allow them to stay. And it was all because a stranger, a deputy marshal with kind eyes, had stopped to help when he could have easily ridden past. Abigail gently laid Emma on the bed and unpacked her few possessions. From the bottom of her carpet bag, she withdrew a small leather-bound Bible, the pages worn from frequent handling. Inside the front cover was an inscription in her father's handwriting. To my daughter Abigail, may faith guide your path. Father, 1876. She traced the words with her finger, remembering her father's face. He had died the year after giving her this Bible, never living to see her marry or to meet his granddaughter. Her mother had passed years earlier, leaving Abigail truly alone in the world when Thomas died. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. A young girl stood in the hallway with a steaming bucket of water. Mrs. Lacey sent this up for your bath, madam, the girl said, bobbing a quick curtsy. And these too. She handed over a folded nightgown and a small cake of soap. Thank you, Abigail said, touched by the unexpected kindness. What's your name? Sadie, madam. I help Mrs. Lacey with the heavy work. Well, thank you, Sadie. I'm Abigail Winters, and this is Emma. The girl glanced curiously at the baby before scurrying away. Abigail filled the small tub in the corner of the room and gratefully sank into the hot water, washing away the dust and weariness of the trail. Afterward, she fed Emma and settled the baby in the center of the bed, creating a protective barrier of pillows around her. For the first time in months, Abigail allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. Perhaps Hachita, this dusty outpost in the New Mexico territory, could become a place to rebuild her life. As she drifted toward sleep, her thoughts turned once more to Deputy Daniel Russell and his promise that she would never sleep cold again. The next weeks passed in a blur of work and adjustment as Abigail settled into her role at the boarding house. Mrs. Lacey proved to be demanding but fair, and Abigail quickly became indispensable, managing the kitchen and accounts with efficiency that impressed the older woman. The boarders were mostly men miners, cowboys, and traveling salesmen passing through. They treated Abigail with a mixture of respect and distant curiosity, tipping their hats when they encountered her in the hallways and complimenting her cooking at mealtimes. Emma thrived in their new environment, growing plumper and more alert each day. When Abigail worked in the kitchen, the baby rested in a makeshift cradle Mrs. Lacey had unearthed from the attic, occasionally cooing and watching the activity around her with bright, curious eyes. You've got yourself a smart one there, Mrs. Lacey observed one afternoon as Emma tracked her movements across the kitchen. Notices everything that child does. She's like her father that way, Abigail replied, a familiar pang of grief accompanying the words. Thomas was always observing, always thinking. Mrs. Lacey nodded. You miss him still. Every day, Abigail admitted, but Emma gives me a reason to keep going. Children have a way of doing that, the older woman agreed, a distant look in her eyes. Lost my boy in '62, Auntie Edem. Never quite got over it, but you learn to live around the hole they leave. This glimpse into Mrs. Lacey's past explained much about the woman's gruff exterior and occasional moments of unexpected kindness. Abigail reached out impulsively to squeeze the older woman's gnarled hand. I'm sorry for your loss, she said softly. Mrs. Lacey patted Abigail's hand before withdrawing her own. That's life, child, full of losses and new beginnings. She changed the subject abruptly. Deputy Russell's due back in town tomorrow, according to Sheriff Miller. Abigail felt a sudden flutter in her stomach that she attributed to surprise. Oh, does he come through often? Every few weeks, Mrs. Lacey replied, a knowing glint in her eyes. He always stays here when he's in Hatchita. That evening, Abigail found herself taking extra care with her appearance, washing her hair and mending a tear in her best dress, the dark blue one that Thomas had always said matched her eyes. She told herself it was simply a matter of looking presentable for all the boarders, but Mrs. Lacey's knowing smile suggested the older woman wasn't fooled. Daniel arrived the next afternoon, dust-covered and weary from the trail. Abigail was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard his deep voice greeting Mrs. Lacey in the front hall. She wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly nervous. Well, look who's here, Mrs. Lacey announced, appearing in the kitchen doorway with Daniel behind her. Our deputy marshal's back from chasing outlaws. Daniel removed his hat, revealing hair damp with sweat from the ride. His face brightened when he saw Abigail. Mrs. Winters, he greeted her. You're looking well. And where's little Emma? Napping upstairs, Abigail replied, gesturing toward the ceiling. She's growing so fast you might not recognize her. I'll look forward to seeing that for myself, he said with a warm smile that made Abigail's cheeks flush. Mrs. Lacey glanced between them with undisguised interest. Dinner's at 6 as usual, deputy. Your regular room is ready. She turned to Abigail. I'll finish up here. Why don't you show the deputy to his room? Before Abigail could protest, Mrs. Lacey had taken the wooden spoon from her hand and shooed them both from the kitchen. She's as subtle as a stampede, Daniel commented as they climbed the stairs. Abigail laughed despite her embarrassment. Mrs. Lacey has definite ideas about how things should be. She's a good woman, Daniel agreed. Tough as rawhide, but fair. She's been very kind to Emma and me, Abigail said as they reached the second-floor landing. She's even teaching me to manage the books for the boarding house. Daniel nodded approvingly. You've made a place for yourself quickly. Thanks to you, Abigail said softly. If you hadn't found us that night, you'd have found another way, Daniel interrupted gently. You strike me as a survivor, Mrs. Winters. They paused outside his room, and for a moment neither spoke. Abigail was acutely aware of his presence tall and solid beside her in the narrow hallway, his eyes warm as they studied her face. Abigail, she said suddenly. Please call me Abigail. A smile touched his lips. Abigail, he repeated, the name sounding different in his deep voice. I'm glad to see you settling in here. The cry of a waking baby broke the moment. That's Emma, Abigail said, stepping back. I should go to her. Dinner's at 6. I'll be there, Daniel promised. As Abigail hurried to her room, her heart was beating faster than the situation warranted. She told herself firmly that it was simply gratitude she felt toward the man who had saved her and Emma from a desperate situation. Nothing more. But that evening at dinner, as she watched Daniel interacting with the other boarders respectful to the older men, kind to young Sadie who helped serve the meal, telling stories that made even Mrs. Lacey crack a rare smile. Abigail knew she was in danger of developing feelings that went beyond gratitude. After the meal, when the other boarders had retired to the parlor for cards or conversation, Daniel approached Abigail as she cleared the table. "I brought something for Emma," he said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small wooden rattle beautifully carved with intricate patterns. "Made it myself during the evenings on the trail." Abigail accepted the gift, touched by the thoughtfulness. "It's beautiful, Daniel, thank you." "It's nothing fancy," he said with a self-deprecating shrug. "My father was a carpenter, taught me to whittle when I was a boy." "Emma will love it," Abigail assured him, then hesitated. "Would you like to see her? She should be awake now after her evening feeding." Daniel nodded, and they climbed the stairs to Abigail's room. Emma lay on a blanket on the bed, kicking her legs and gurgling happily. When she saw the new faces, she waved her arms excitedly. "She's grown," Daniel observed, crouching beside the bed to look at the baby. "Hello there, little miss." Emma cooed in response, reaching toward him with curious hands. Daniel offered her his finger, which she promptly gripped with surprising strength. "Strong girl you've got," he told Abigail. "Like her mother," Mrs. Lacey commented from the doorway, making them both jump. The older woman gave them a pointed look. "Door stays open, mind, Mrs. Lacey," Abigail protested, mortified. Daniel straightened, the tips of his ears reddening. "Yes, madam," he agreed solemnly. "Wouldn't want to cause any gossip." Mrs. Lacey snorted. "Bit late for that. Half the town's already decided you two are sweet on each other." She shook her head. "Just mind proprieties. Hatcheta's a small town with big eyes and bigger mouths." After she departed, Daniel and Abigail exchanged embarrassed glances that dissolved into quiet laughter. "I'm sorry about that," Abigail said. "She's very protective." "She's right," Daniel replied, his expression growing more serious. "Your reputation is important, especially as a widow with a child." Abigail nodded, appreciating his concern. "How long will you be in Hatcheta this time?" "Just 2 days," he said. "I'm due in Silver City by week's end. There's been trouble with claim jumpers up that way." "Silver City," Abigail repeated softly. "That's where we were headed, Emma and I. Thomas's brother has a claim there, Jackson Winters." Daniel asked, surprise evident in his voice. "Yes, do you know him?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Met him a few times. Good man by all accounts, steady, doing well with his claim from what I hear." "I wrote to him after Thomas died," Abigail explained, "but I never received a reply. I thought perhaps he might help us, being Emma's uncle." "Mail's unreliable in these parts," Daniel said. "Letters get lost, especially to mining camps. He might never have received word of your situation." "Perhaps," Abigail agreed, though doubt lingered. Jackson had never approved of his younger brother's marriage to a schoolteacher with no dowry. She suspected he had simply chosen to ignore her plea for help. Daniel seemed to read her thoughts. "When I'm in Silver City, I could look him up. Let him know you and Emma are in Hatcheta." "Would you?" Abigail asked, then hesitated. "But what if he doesn't want anything to do with us?" "Then you're no worse off than you are now," Daniel pointed out, "and you've made a place for yourself here already." Abigail considered this, looking around the small but comfortable room that had become their home. "Yes," she agreed. "We have." Emma began to fuss, and Abigail lifted her from the bed, cradling her against her shoulder. "It's past her bedtime," she explained. "And I'm sure you're tired from the trail." Daniel nodded, backing toward the door. "I'll see you at breakfast then. Good night, Abigail. Good night, little Emma." After he left, Abigail sat on the edge of her bed, gently rocking Emma while her mind raced with conflicting thoughts. The idea of Jackson Winters learning of their whereabouts stirred mixed emotions. He was Emma's only living relative besides herself, and family connections were important. But Abigail had also begun to build a life in Hachita, a simple life, but one with security and purpose. And then there was Daniel Russell, with his kind eyes and quiet strength. A man who carved wooden rattles during lonely nights on the trail and remembered a widow and her baby he had found stranded in the wilderness. Abigail pushed these confusing thoughts aside, focusing instead on settling Emma for the night. Tomorrow would bring what it would, and she had learned through hard experience to take each day as it came. The next morning at breakfast, Daniel was already seated at the table when Abigail entered the dining room with Emma in her arms. He rose politely. Along with the other male boarders, a railroad man, 2 cattle buyers, and an elderly gentleman who wrote for an Eastern newspaper. "Allow me," Daniel offered, pulling out her chair. "Thank you," Abigail replied, settling Emma in her lap as she sat. The conversation flowed easily around the table, talk of cattle prices, the progress of the railroad, and local gossip. Abigail was content to listen, contributing occasionally while managing to eat one-handed as Emma dozed against her chest. "That child needs a cradle," Mrs. Lacey observed as she refilled coffee cups. "Can't keep balancing her on your knee forever." "I've been saving to buy one," Abigail replied. "Jenkins over at the Mercantile has one," the railroad man offered helpfully. "Sitting there since the Macpherson baby outgrew it last year, might let it go cheap." Daniel caught Abigail's eye across the table. "I could talk to Jenkins while I'm in town today." "That's very kind," Abigail began, "but consider it a late welcome gift," Daniel interrupted gently. Before Abigail could protest further, Mrs. Lacey interjected. "Take the man's offer, girl. Pride's all well and good, but that baby needs somewhere proper to sleep." The other boarders nodded in agreement, and Abigail found herself outvoted. "Thank you, Daniel," she conceded. "That's very generous." After breakfast, Daniel departed for town while Abigail began her daily chores. The morning passed quickly as she helped Mrs. Lacey prepare rooms for new arrivals expected that afternoon. Emma contentedly watched from her blanket on the parlor floor, occasionally entertaining herself with the wooden rattle Daniel had carved. Shortly after noon, Daniel returned with Mr. Jenkins from the Mercantile, both men carrying a beautifully crafted oak cradle between them. "Where would you like it, Mrs. Winters?" Jenkins asked, beaming proudly as if he'd made the cradle himself. "In my room, please," Abigail directed, leading the way upstairs. Once the cradle was positioned to her satisfaction and Jenkins had departed, Abigail turned to Daniel with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "This is too much," she protested. "I can't possibly accept. It's just a cradle, Abigail," Daniel interrupted. "And it gives me peace of mind knowing Emma has a proper place to sleep." Abigail ran her hand over the smooth wood, noting the quality craftsmanship. "It must have cost a month's wages." Daniel shrugged. "Jenkins owed me a favor, and I threw in that bearskin I had on my pack horse." He smiled at her expression. "Don't worry, I've got another at my cabin. I don't know how to thank you. Seeing that little one safe and comfortable is thanks enough," he assured her. Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, a moment of connection that went beyond gratitude or kindness. Abigail looked away first, her cheeks warming. "You leave for Silver City tomorrow?" she asked, changing the subject. Daniel nodded. "At first light. Should be there by nightfall if the weather holds. And you'll speak to Jackson Winters, if you still want me to." Abigail considered this carefully. "Yes," she decided. Emma should know her father's family if possible, but she hesitated. "Please don't tell him about our circumstances when you found us. I wouldn't want him to think ill of Thomas." Daniel's expression softened with understanding. "I'll be discreet." That evening after dinner, the other boarders gathered in the parlor for their usual entertainment cards, conversation, or rating. Abigail, having put Emma down in her new cradle, joined them briefly before excusing herself to finish some mending in her room. As she climbed the stairs, she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Daniel following. "I wanted to say goodbye," he explained. "I'll be gone before breakfast." "Of course," Abigail replied, pausing on the landing. "Be careful on the trail to Silver City. I've heard there are bandits in the mountains." Daniel smiled at her concern. "I've made the journey dozens of times. I'll be fine." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, neither quite ready to part. "I made something for your journey," Abigail said suddenly, remembering. "Wait here." She hurried to her room and returned with a small package wrapped in brown paper. Just some biscuits and jerky for the trail, and a jar of Mrs. Lacey's apple preserves. Daniel accepted the package with genuine appreciation. "Thank you. Trail rations get mighty tiresome." "It's the least I could do, after all you've done for us." Another silence fell between them, filled with unspoken words and growing awareness. "When I return from Silver City," Daniel said finally, "would you allow me to call on you properly? Not just as a boarder in this house, but as a man calling on a lady he admires." Abigail's heart quickened at his words. "Daniel, I'm a widow with a child." "I'm well aware of that," he replied steadily, "and it changes nothing about my regard for you." Abigail searched his face, finding only sincerity in his expression. "It's been less than 2 months since Thomas died," she said softly. "I'm not sure what I feel or what's proper." Daniel nodded, accepting her hesitation without resentment. "I understand. There's no rush, Abigail. When I return, if you're willing to receive my call, I'd be honored. If not, I'll respect your decision." His consideration touched her deeply. "Thank you for understanding. Get some rest," he said gently, "and give little Emma a good-night kiss from me." Abigail watched him descend the stairs, conflicting emotions swirling within her. Part of her felt she was betraying Thomas's memory by even considering Daniel's request. Another part recognized that life in the territories was harsh and brief opportunities for happiness shouldn't be dismissed lightly. In her room, Abigail found Emma sleeping peacefully in her new cradle. She touched the baby's soft cheek, thinking of the man who had ensured they would never again sleep cold on the hard ground, a man who asked for nothing in return except the chance to know them better. "What would your father say, little one?" she whispered to the sleeping infant. "Would he want us to be alone or to find happiness where we can?" Emma stirred slightly but didn't wake, offering no answers to her mother's troubled questions. The days after Daniel's departure passed slowly for Abigail, filled with the routines of the boarding house: cooking, cleaning, mending, and caring for Emma. She found herself watching the road from the upstairs windows, though she knew it was too soon for his return. A week after he left, a traveling peddler brought news from Silver City. A new silver strike had been discovered. Claim jumping was rampant, and the town was overflowing with miners, gamblers, and those hoping to profit from both. The peddler mentioned a shooting at one of the saloons, but couldn't recall the names involved. Abigail worried for Daniel's safety, imagining him trying to keep order in such chaos. She worried too about what news Jackson Winters might have for her. Would he welcome his brother's widow and child, or reject them as he had seemingly rejected her letter? Mrs. Lacey noticed her preoccupation. "Fretting won't bring him back faster," the older woman observed as they prepared dinner one evening. "Deputy Russell can take care of himself." "I know," Abigail replied, embarrassed at being so transparent. "It's just, Silver City sounds dangerous." "Everywhere's dangerous out here, Mrs. Lacey said matter-of-factly. That's why finding someone to stand with you matters more than it might back east. Abigail glanced at the older woman, surprised by this philosophical turn. Is that why you never remarried after your husband died? You couldn't find someone to stand with you, Mrs. Lacey's weathered face softened briefly. Had my chance once. Station master over in Deeming. Good man, kind to me, but I couldn't leave this place. She gestured around the kitchen. Built it with my Henry before the war, couldn't bear to leave his memory behind. Do you regret it? Abigail asked gently. Mrs. Lacey considered this, her gnarled hands continuing to knead bread dough as she thought. Sometimes, she admitted finally. Winter nights get long and cold when you're alone, but we all make our choices and live with them. She fixed Abigail with a shrewd look. You're young yet. Don't let guilt or fear make your choices for you. Before Abigail could respond, Sadie burst into the kitchen, her young face flushed with excitement. Riders coming, she announced. Looks like Deputy Russell and another man. Abigail's heart leaped, but she forced herself to remain calm. Thank you, Sadie. Please tell Mrs. Lacey. The girl darted off, and Abigail resisted the urge to rush to the window. Instead, she checked on Emma, who was napping in her cradle in the corner of the kitchen, then straightened her apron and smoothed her hair. The sound of horses arriving outside drew her to the front of the boarding house despite her attempts at nonchalance. Through the window, she saw Daniel dismounting, looking tired but unharmed. Beside him was another man, tall and lean with features that made Abigail's breath catch. He had Thomas's nose and chin, the family resemblance unmistakable. Jackson Winters had come to Hatcheta. Abigail stood frozen in the hallway as the front door opened and Daniel entered, removing his hat. His eyes found her immediately, warming with pleasure at the sight of her. Abigail, he greeted her. Hope we're not too early for dinner. We rode hard to get here before nightfall. Before she could reply, the second man stepped through the door. Jackson Winters was older than Thomas had been, perhaps 40, with gray streaking his dark hair and lines etched deeply around his eyes and mouth. He studied Abigail with an expression she couldn't read. Mrs. Winters, Daniel continued, may I present Mr. Jackson Winters? Madam, Jackson said, removing his hat. His voice was deeper than Thomas's had been, rougher from years of tobacco and whiskey. I understand you're my brother's widow. Yes, Abigail confirmed, finding her voice at last. It's good to meet you, Mr. Winters. Thomas spoke of you often. Jackson's expression remained guarded. Deputy Russell here says you have a child, Thomas's child. Yes, a daughter, Emma. Abigail gestured toward the kitchen. She's napping at the moment. An awkward silence fell, broken by Mrs. Lacey's arrival in the hallway. Don't leave these men standing in the doorway, girl, she scolded. Mr. Russell, good to see you back safe. And you must be Mr. Winters. I'm Martha Lacey. This is my establishment. Jackson nodded respectfully. Madam. Dinner's in an hour, Mrs. Lacey continued briskly. Abigail, show Mr. Winters to the blue room. It's ready for a guest. She turned to Daniel. Your usual room is waiting, deputy. As Mrs. Lacey bustled back toward the kitchen, the awkwardness eased slightly. Abigail gathered her composure and gestured toward the stairs. If you'll follow me, Mr. Winters, I'll show you to your room. The men retrieved their saddlebags, and Abigail led them upstairs. After showing Jackson to his room, she continued down the hall with Daniel toward his usual quarters. Thank you for bringing him, she said quietly when they were out of Jackson's hearing. He wanted to come, Daniel replied. When I told him about you and Emma, he was quite affected, said he never received your letter. And my circumstances, you didn't tell him. Only that you were working here at the boarding house and doing well, Daniel assured her. The rest is yours to share or keep as you choose. Abigail nodded gratefully. How was Silver City? Rowdy, Daniel admitted. Had to break up a few fights. One man killed over a card game. He saw the concern in her eyes and quickly added, "Nothing I couldn't handle." "I was worried," Abigail confessed, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Daniel's expression softened. "Were you now?" Before Abigail could respond, Emma's cry echoed from downstairs. "I should go to her," she said, grateful for the interruption. "You must be tired from the journey. I'll see you at dinner." As she hurried downstairs, Abigail's mind whirled with the implications of Jackson Winters' arrival. Would he offer her and Emma a place in Silver City? Did she even want that anymore? Emma was fussing in her cradle when Abigail reached the kitchen. She lifted the baby, soothing her with gentle words as Mrs. Lacey continued preparing dinner. "So that's Thomas Winters' brother," the older woman observed, slicing bread with efficient strokes. "Looks like a hard man." "The mining life isn't easy," Abigail replied diplomatically. "Neither is raising a child alone," Mrs. Lacey countered. "Question is, what does he want with you and little Emma after all this time?" It was a question Abigail had been asking herself since seeing Jackson Winters on Daniel's heels. "I don't know," she admitted. "I wrote to him after Thomas died, but he claims he never received my letter." "HMPH," Mrs. Lacey snorted skeptically. "Well, we'll see what he has to say for himself at dinner." Dinner that evening was an unusually quiet affair. The regular boarders, sensing tension in the air, kept their conversation minimal. Jackson Winters ate steadily, occasionally glancing at Emma, who sat contentedly in her mother's lap, playing with the wooden rattle Daniel had carved. "Fine-looking child," Jackson commented finally. "Has Thomas's eyes." "Yes," Abigail agreed, stroking Emma's downy head. "And his smile." "Never thought my brother would settle down," Jackson continued. "Always was the restless type." "He wanted to make a good life for us," Abigail said softly. "That's why we were coming to Silver City. He thought you might help him get established." Jackson's expression grew somber. "Would have if I'd known. Like I told the deputy here, never got word he was married, let alone had a child on the way." He glanced around the table, clearly uncomfortable discussing family matters in front of strangers. "Perhaps we could talk privately after dinner." "Of course," Abigail agreed. When the meal concluded, Daniel caught her eye as she rose from the table. "I'll take Emma for a while if you'd like," he offered. "Give you and Mr. Winters time to talk." Abigail hesitated, touched by the offer but uncertain about leaving Emma, even with Daniel. "I can help the deputy, Mrs. Lacey interjected, wiping her hands on her apron. "Been a while since I held a baby, but I reckon I remember how." Reassured, Abigail handed Emma to Mrs. Lacey, who immediately began cooing to the infant. Daniel's eyes met Abigail's briefly, conveying silent support before he turned to follow Mrs. Lacey to the parlor. Abigail led Jackson Winters to a small sitting room at the back of the house, used primarily by Mrs. Lacey for receiving visitors. They sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment before Jackson cleared his throat. "Thomas's death hit me hard," he began gruffly. "We weren't close these last years, but he was still my brother, my only family." "I'm sorry for your loss," Abigail said sincerely. "He spoke of you often, always with respect." Jackson nodded, accepting this. "Deputy Russell says you were headed to Silver City when your wagon broke down. That you were alone with the baby." Abigail tensed, wondering how much Daniel had revealed despite his promise of discretion. "Yes, the wagon train left us behind when I fell ill." "And Deputy Russell found you." "He did," Abigail confirmed, offering no further details. Jackson studied her face, then glanced around the modest sitting room. "You've made a place for yourself here." "Mrs. Lacey has been very kind," Abigail agreed. "The work is steady, and Emma is thriving." It's no place to raise Thomas's daughter, Jackson said bluntly. A boarding house in a backwater town like Hatcheta. Abigail bristled at his dismissive tone. It's a respectable establishment, Mr. Winters, and Hatcheta may be small, but the people have been kind to us. I'm not questioning that, Jackson replied, raising a placating hand. But Silver City offers more opportunities, schools eventually, proper society for a growing girl. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. I have a good claim, Abigail. Just struck a new vein last month. I can provide for you and Emma. Give you the life Thomas would have wanted for you. The offer took Abigail by surprise, despite half expecting it. You're proposing we come live with you in Silver City. I have a house, Jackson explained. Nothing fancy but solid. 3 bedrooms, plenty of room for you and the baby. He hesitated. It's what Thomas would have wanted. Family taking care of family. Abigail considered his words carefully. That's very generous, Mr. Winters, but we've only just met, and I have commitments here to Mrs. Lacey. She can find another helper, Jackson said dismissively. Emma is my brother's child, my blood, my responsibility. She's my child, Abigail corrected gently but firmly. And while I appreciate your offer, I need time to consider what's best for us. Jackson frowned but nodded reluctantly. Of course, it's a big decision, but I'll be returning to Silver City the day after tomorrow. I can't leave my claim untended for long. I understand, Abigail said. I'll give you my answer before you leave. As they rejoined the others in the parlor, Abigail found her gaze drawn to Daniel, who was holding Emma with surprising ease, talking softly to the baby as she gripped his finger. The sight stirred something in Abigail's heart, a warmth and longing she hadn't expected to feel again after Thomas's death. Jackson Winters followed her gaze, his expression thoughtful. When Mrs. Lacey offered him a drink, he accepted gratefully, leaving Abigail free to approach Daniel. She likes you, Abigail observed as Emma cooed happily in Daniel's arms. Smart girl, Daniel replied with a smile. Takes after her mother. The compliment brought color to Abigail's cheeks. Jackson has offered us a home in Silver City, she said quietly. Daniel's expression remained carefully neutral. That's generous of him. Yes, Abigail agreed, watching Emma's tiny hand pat Daniel's chest. He says it's what Thomas would have wanted, family taking care of family. Is that what you want? Daniel asked, his voice soft enough that only she could hear. Abigail hesitated. I don't know, she admitted. Silver City would offer Emma more opportunities as she grows, and Jackson is her only blood relative besides me. Daniel nodded, his eyes holding hers. Those are important considerations. But we've made a life here, Abigail continued. Found friends, security. Hatcheta's a good town, Daniel agreed, growing steadily. It might not have all Silver City's advantages now, but given time. And there's Mrs. Lacey, Abigail added. She's come to depend on me. Daniel smiled slightly. Mrs. Lacey would survive. She survived before you came, and she'd manage after. Don't make your decision based on obligation to her. Then what should I base it on? Daniel shifted Emma to his other arm, his expression growing more serious. On what will bring you and Emma happiness, Abigail, not just security or opportunity, but joy. The simplicity and truth of his words struck Abigail deeply. Before she could respond, Jackson approached, extending his arms for the baby. May I hold my niece? He asked. Daniel handed Emma over carefully. She's a good-natured little thing, he told Jackson. Hardly cries at all from what I've seen. Jackson held the baby somewhat awkwardly, studying her face with open curiosity. Hello there, little Emma, he said, his gruff voice softening. You look like your daddy. Yes, you do. Emma regarded this new person solemnly before breaking into a gummy smile that made Jackson chuckle despite himself. She's got the Winters charm already, he commented, glancing at Abigail. Thomas had that same smile. Could talk his way into or out of anything with it. Yes, Abigail agreed softly, memory briefly overwhelming her. He could. The evening wore on, with conversation flowing more easily as the initial awkwardness faded. When Emma began to fuss, Abigail excused herself to put the baby to bed, grateful for a moment alone to gather her thoughts. In her room, as she settled Emma in her cradle, Abigail found herself torn between conflicting desires. Silver City offered the security of family, greater opportunities for Emma's future, and connection to Thomas's legacy. Yet the thought of leaving Hatchita, leaving Daniel, created an ache in her chest she couldn't ignore. She was still awake hours later, staring at the ceiling as moonlight filtered through her window, when a soft knock sounded at her door. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders over her nightdress, Abigail opened it to find Daniel standing in the hallway, looking as sleepless as she felt. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he whispered, careful not to wake Emma or the other boarders. "I couldn't sleep knowing you were facing such a decision without me speaking my mind." Abigail glanced toward the other rooms, aware of the impropriety of this midnight conversation, but unwilling to send him away. "Come in," she whispered, leaving the door partially open for propriety's sake. Daniel entered, keeping a respectful distance as Abigail perched on the edge of her bed. He remained standing, hat in his hands, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I've been thinking about what Jackson Winters offered you," he began. "As have I," Abigail admitted. "It's a good offer," Daniel continued. "Security for you and Emma, family connection. But—" Abigail prompted, sensing his hesitation. "But I'm selfish enough to hope you'll stay," Daniel said quietly. "I know it's too soon. I know you're still grieving Thomas, but the thought of you and Emma going to Silver City—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "What are you saying, Daniel?" He met her eyes directly. "I'm saying I care for you, Abigail, more than I should, perhaps, given how recently you lost your husband. More than is wise, given my work takes me away for weeks at a time." He took a deep breath. "I'm saying that if you stay, I'd like the chance to court you properly when you're ready. And if that day comes when you might consider more than friendship, I'd count myself the luckiest man in the territory." Abigail's heart raced at his words. "Daniel." "You don't need to answer now," he said quickly. "I just wanted you to know where I stand before you make your decision. It wouldn't be fair otherwise." Abigail rose from the bed, closing the distance between them. "It's not just about what's practical or sensible," she said softly. "If it were, I'd accept Jackson's offer without hesitation." "And yet you hesitate," Daniel observed. "Because of you," Abigail admitted. "Because when you found Emma and me that night, you didn't just save us from the cold. You gave me hope when I thought all hope was lost." She reached out tentatively, touching his hand. "I'm not ready for promises or commitments. Thomas has only been gone a few months, but I know that the thought of leaving Hatchita, leaving you, feels wrong." Daniel's fingers closed gently around hers. "Then don't go," he said simply. A small sound from the cradle interrupted them, Emma stirring in her sleep. They both turned to look at the baby, their hands still joined. "Whatever you decide," Daniel said, reluctantly releasing her hand, "I'll respect it. But know that there's a place for you here if you want it. Not just at Mrs. Lacey's boarding house, but in Hatchita. In the life I'm building." He backed toward the door. "Think on it, Abigail, that's all I ask." After he left, Abigail stood motionless in the center of her room, her hand still warm from his touch. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt the stirring of something beyond grief and duty, a flicker of possibility, of a future she hadn't dared imagine. She moved to Emma's cradle, watching the baby's peaceful sleep. "What should we do, little one?" she whispered. What would make us truly happy? The answer, when it came to her in the quiet darkness, was surprisingly clear. The next morning, Abigail sought out Jackson Winters after breakfast, finding him smoking on the front porch of the boarding house. She joined him, Emma in her arms, breathing in the crisp autumn air. "I've been thinking about your offer," she began without preamble. Jackson nodded, tapping ash from his cigarette. "And it's very generous," Abigail continued. "And I'm grateful that you want to provide for Thomas's child." "But," Jackson prompted, echoing Daniel's word from the night before. Abigail met his gaze directly. "But Emma and I have begun to build a life here. It's not grand or exciting, but it's ours. I have work that suits me, friends who support us, and—" She hesitated. "And Deputy Russell," Jackson finished for her, his expression knowing rather than judgmental. Abigail didn't deny it. "Yes, Daniel has been kind to us from the beginning." Jackson studied her face, then looked out across the dusty main street of Hatcheta. "Thomas would have wanted you to be happy," he said finally. "He wasn't perfect, God knows we Winters men rarely are, but he loved you. That much was clear from his letters." "You received his letters?" Abigail asked, surprised. "A few," Jackson admitted. "Not as many as I should have, living the way we did, moving from strike to strike." He glanced at Emma. "He never mentioned the baby was coming, though. Must have been after his last letter." "He was so proud when he found out," Abigail said softly. "Bought a silver rattle he couldn't afford and talked of nothing but teaching his son to fish and hunt." "Son?" Jackson raised an eyebrow. Abigail smiled. "He was convinced it would be a boy. When Emma was born, he laughed and said she was stubborn like her mother, refusing to follow his plans." Jackson chuckled. "Sounds like Thomas." He grew serious again. "I understand why you want to stay, Abigail, but I want you to know my door is always open to you and Emma, your family, whether you live under my roof or not." "Thank you, Jackson," Abigail said sincerely. "That means more than you know." He reached out tentatively, touching Emma's cheek with a weathered finger. "She really does have his eyes." "Yes," Abigail agreed. "And I'll make sure she knows all about her father as she grows. The good man he was, the dreams he had." "See that you do," Jackson said gruffly. "And I'd like to visit sometimes, if that's agreeable. Get to know my niece." "Of course," Abigail assured him. "You're always welcome." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Jackson spoke again. "Russell seems like a good man." "He is," Abigail confirmed. "Not like most lawmen I've known," Jackson continued thoughtfully. "Has a steady way about him, trustworthy." "Yes." Jackson nodded as if coming to a decision. "Well then, I'll leave with an easier mind knowing you found your place here." He stood, crushing his cigarette beneath his boot. "I should check on my horse if I'm to leave tomorrow." As he started down the porch steps, Abigail called after him. "Jackson," he turned back, "thank you for coming all this way, for wanting to do right by us." A rare smile crossed his weathered face. "Family's family, Abigail. Thomas would have done the same for my child." After he departed, Abigail remained on the porch, holding Emma and watching the town come to life around them. Mrs. Lacey found her there some time later. "So," the older woman said without preamble. "Silver City or Hatcheta?" "Hatcheta," Abigail replied simply. Mrs. Lacey nodded, unsurprised. "Good, would have missed you and this little one." She reached for Emma, who went willingly into her arms. "And not just because you make better biscuits than I do." Abigail laughed. "High praise indeed from you, Mrs. Lacey." "Well, don't let it go to your head," the older woman grumbled, though her eyes twinkled. "Now come help me with lunch. Those railroad men eat like they're never seeing food again." As they turned to go inside, Abigail spotted Daniel crossing the street toward the boarding house, returning from his morning duties at the marshal's office. Their eyes met, and even at a distance, the question in his was clear. Abigail smiled, a simple gesture that conveyed her decision more clearly than words could have. The answering smile that broke across Daniel's face warmed her more thoroughly than the autumn sun. "Took you long enough to figure it out," Mrs. Lacey muttered, following Abigail's gaze. "Now stop mooning and come help with these potatoes. Romance doesn't put food on the table." But Abigail noticed the older woman was smiling too as they headed inside, Emma babbling happily between them. That evening, after Jackson had retired early to prepare for his morning departure, Abigail found herself alone with Daniel in the parlor. The other boarders had gone to the saloon for their evening entertainment, and Mrs. Lacey had tactfully withdrawn to her quarters, taking Emma with her to give the child a taste for good literature as she read from her beloved Dickens. "You're staying," Daniel said, making it a statement rather than a question. Abigail nodded. "Yes, Jackson understands. He even gave his blessing in his way." "I'm glad," Daniel replied simply, "though I would have respected your choice either way." "I know you would have," Abigail said. "That's one of the reasons I'm staying." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Daniel spoke again. "I meant what I said last night, Abigail. I don't expect anything from you. I know you need time." "I do," she agreed, "but not as much as I thought." She met his gaze directly. "Thomas will always be part of me, part of Emma. He was a good man, and I loved him truly. But he's gone, and Emma and I are still here, still living." Daniel reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. "Life out here is too short and too hard to waste a moment of happiness when it's offered," he said softly. "Yes," Abigail agreed, her fingers tightening around his. "That's what I've come to understand." Outside, the wind picked up, whistling around the corners of the boarding house and rattling the windows. Abigail thought of that cold night when Daniel had found them, of Emma sleeping on the hard ground beside her, and of the promise he had made. "You'll never sleep cold again," she quoted softly. Daniel's eyes warmed with recognition. "I meant it then. I mean it still." In that moment, with his hand warm and steady around hers and the future stretching before them uncertain but full of possibility, Abigail believed him completely. The winter of 1881 passed into spring, bringing new growth to the harsh landscape around Hatcheta and new developments to Abigail's life. Jackson Winters made good on his promise to visit, arriving for 2 days around Christmas with presents for Emma and news from Silver City. He and Daniel formed a cautious friendship based on mutual respect, and their shared concern for Abigail and Emma's well-being. Daniel courted Abigail properly through those months, calling at the boarding house when his duties permitted, taking her and Emma for Sunday drives in a borrowed buggy, and bringing small, thoughtful gifts that demonstrated his growing understanding of her needs and tastes. A book of poetry when she mentioned missing her father's library, fabric for a new dress when her old one grew shabby, seeds for the kitchen garden she tended behind Mrs. Lacey's boarding house. For Emma, there were carved wooden animals to join the rattle. He had made a horse, a cow, a bear that made her giggle when she touched its whiskered face. He taught Abigail to ride, something she'd never learned growing up in town, and showed her the beauty of the territory that had initially seemed so harsh and unwelcoming. As winter melted into spring, Emma grew from infant to toddler, saying her first words, "Mama," followed closely by Dan, and taking her first stumbling steps across the boarding house parlor into Daniel's waiting arms. On a warm evening in late May, Daniel took Abigail to his property north of town, 10 acres with a small but solid cabin, a corral for horses, and grazing land stretching to the distant hills. Wildflowers dotted the landscape, adding splashes of color to the rugged beauty. "It's not much," Daniel said as he helped her down from the wagon where Emma slept peacefully in a nest of blankets. "But it's paid for, and there's room to expand." Abigail understood what he wasn't saying explicitly, that he was showing her not just his home, but their potential future. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "Peaceful." "I built the cabin myself," Daniel explained, leading her toward the simple structure. "Took 3 years of saving and working between martial duties." The cabin was small but meticulously crafted, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area, and 2 small bedrooms. The furniture was simple but solid: a table with 4 chairs, a comfortable-looking armchair by the stone fireplace, shelves lined with books that surprised Abigail with their variety. "You read Shakespeare?" she asked, running her fingers along the leather-bound spines. "My mother was a schoolteacher," Daniel explained. "Made sure her sons appreciated literature, even if we were more interested in hunting and fishing at the time." He smiled at the memory. "She'd have liked you." Abigail returned his smile. "I think I would have liked her too." They returned to the wagon to check on Emma, who still slept soundly, before Daniel led Abigail to a fallen log where they could sit and look out over the property as the sun began its descent toward the western hills. "I've been thinking," Daniel said after a comfortable silence, "about the future." "As have I," Abigail admitted. He turned to face her, his expression serious but gentle. "I love you, Abigail. I think I have since that first night when I found you protecting Emma with nothing but your own body against the cold. I love your strength, your kindness, your determination." Abigail's heart swelled at his words, at the simple truth in them. "I love you too," she said softly. "I wasn't looking for love again, wasn't sure I could find it. But you showed me that the heart has room for more than one love in a lifetime." Daniel took her hand, his fingers warm and steady around hers. "I know Emma will always be Thomas's daughter. I'd never try to replace him in her life or her memory, but I'd like to be a father to her all the same. To watch her grow, to teach her, to protect her." "She already adores you," Abigail said, thinking of how Emma's face lit up whenever Daniel entered a room. "And I adore her," Daniel replied. He took a deep breath, his eyes holding hers. "What I'm trying to say, Abigail, is that I want you and Emma to share my life, to make this place a home, our home. I want to be your husband if you'll have me." Though she had sensed the conversation was leading to this moment, Abigail still felt emotion rise in her throat at his proposal. "Are you certain?" she asked. "Taking on a widow and another man's child." "I've never been more certain of anything," Daniel interrupted gently. "You and Emma aren't burdens to be taken on. You're the family I never thought I'd find." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you, Daniel Russell." His smile was like sunrise breaking across the landscape. He leaned forward, cupping her face in his hands, and kissed her their first kiss, gentle but filled with promise. When they parted, Abigail rested her forehead against his, savoring the moment. "When?" she asked. "Whenever you're ready," Daniel replied. "I know it's only been 7 months since Thomas passed." Abigail considered this. While part of her felt a twinge of guilt at remarrying so soon, she also knew that life in the territories didn't always allow for lengthy mourning periods. Survival often depended on practical arrangements, and her heart had already made its choice. "June," she decided, "when the wildflowers are at their peak." Daniel nodded, his eyes warm with understanding and love. "June it is." They married on a bright Sunday afternoon in late June 1882, with the entire town of Hachita in attendance. The ceremony took place in the small church, with Mrs. Lacey standing proudly beside Abigail and the town marshal serving as Daniel's best man. "Emma," now walking confidently, scattered wildflower petals along the aisle with enthusiastic assistance from Sadie. Jackson Winters traveled from Silver City for the occasion, bringing a silver tea service as a wedding gift and standing in for Abigail's father during the ceremony. His gruff exterior had softened over the months of visiting, and he now doted openly on his niece, who called him Unca Jack and demanded to be carried on his shoulders. After the ceremony, the town gathered for a celebration in the town square, with tables laden with food contributed by every household. Daniel and Abigail danced under the open sky, their happiness reflected in the faces of those who had come to care for them both. As twilight descended, they departed for their cabin, now transformed with Abigail's touch into a true home, with curtains at the windows, quilts on the beds, and flowers in simple vases. Emma fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from the excitement of the day, and Daniel carried her tenderly to the small bedroom that would be hers. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their own room, Abigail thought of how far she had come from that desperate night when all hope seemed lost of the journey from widow to wife, from despair to joy. "What are you thinking?" Daniel asked, his voice soft in the darkness. "That life can change completely in the space between one heartbeat and the next," Abigail replied. "That night when you found us, I thought all was lost, and now," he prompted gently. "Now I understand that endings can also be beginnings," she said, turning in his arms to face him. "That love can come again, different but just as true." Daniel kissed her, a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. "You'll never sleep cold again," he whispered against her lips. "Not as long as I live," and she never did. 2 years later, on a crisp autumn morning in 1884, Abigail stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching as Daniel taught 4-year-old Emma to ride her pony in the corral. The little girl's laughter rang out clear and bright in the morning air as she bounced along, securely held by Daniel's steady hands. "Look, Mama," Emma called out. "I'm riding like Papa." "I see you, darling," Abigail called back, smiling at the easy way Emma used the word Papa for Daniel, while still keeping a special place in her heart for Daddy Thomas, whose photograph sat on her bedside table and whose stories Abigail shared regularly. In Abigail's arms, 6-month-old David Thomas Russell slept peacefully, untroubled by his sister's excited shouts. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes, and a temperament that somehow managed to be both calm and curious. As she watched her family, the family she had found when all seemed lost, Abigail thought again of that cold night outside Hatchita, of her baby sleeping on the hard ground beside her, and of the man who had promised she would never sleep cold again. It was a promise Daniel had kept, not just through physical warmth and shelter, but through the warmth of love that had healed her grieving heart and given both her and Emma a future brighter than she could have imagined. The territory remained harsh and sometimes dangerous. Life was never easy. But they faced it together, day by day, building something strong and lasting in this wild, beautiful land they now called home, and they never slept cold again.